Hi, yes, I'm Samuli Kangaslampi, and about my background, I'm a psychologist by background. I'm permanently employed as university lecturer here in Finland, Tampere, but for this year I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the Department of Neuropsychology and Psychopharmacology at Maastricht University. I am a trauma researcher by background. Most of my research deals with trauma and PTSD, but now I'm studying psychedelics. And today I'm presenting about traumatic and psychedelic experiences. And what I'm getting at basically is, are these experiences actually totally different, or do they have some pretty interesting similarities, and why that might actually be? This talk is very much based on work in progress, so I do welcome all kinds of feedback and ideas and also suggestions for collaboration on these topics. Okay, for the purposes of this talk, by psychedelic experiences, I simply mean the acute state and experience caused by ingestion of psychoactive doses of classic psychedelics. Trauma can mean a million different things, but for this presentation, by traumatic experience, I mean the state caused by exposure to an event or situation of an extremely threatening or horrific nature, as it's defined in the ICD-11, for example. So, physical or sexual violence, risk of death, disasters, war, that sort of thing. So traumatic experiences are terrible things that nobody wants to happen to themselves or others, and they often cause great psychological harm. At the same time, psychedelic experiences are actively sought out by a lot of people, and at least sometimes they are linked with improvements in well-being. So they seem to be pretty different things. But they do appear to share some features. And I'll start with the obvious case. Are psychedelic experiences sometimes traumatic? The brief answer, yes. Sometimes psychedelic experiences do appear to be frankly traumatic. It is possible. Some psychedelic experiences involve experiences of psychological death, great threat to psychological coherence and wholeness, horrific visual scenes, great fear and anxiety. In the worst cases, also violence and abuse. So these are hallmarks of traumatic events. Clearly, psychedelic experiences sometimes can be traumatic, and people can have symptoms very similar or practically the same as PTSD or acute stress disorder after these sort of experiences. For example, the recent book Psychedelic Integration by Mark Aishala provides examples clearly of this kind of experiences. They do happen. Now, in addition, some descriptions of the re-experiencing of the effects of psychedelics and so-called flashbacks are also quite similar to trauma-related re-experiencing. So people might re-experience the altered state of consciousness, sensory re-experiencing, experience of depersonalization, derealization. And these may be explainable through fairly similar mechanisms, in fact. But we should emphasize that not all re-experiencing of psychedelic effects is perceived as negative. Some people quite like it and actually sort of seek it out. Even when psychedelic experiences include elements of struggle, suffering, hardship, fear, and even the worst kind of trips are not traumatic. They don't traumatize people. And I would argue, and other people have also argued, that some of the afterglow effects of psychedelics, and maybe even the therapeutic effects, may be attributable to these kind of struggles, overcoming struggles, surviving, making it through. Just being glad that it's over might make you feel better the next day. And I should also point out that, as Eva also mentioned in her talk, people do recall and re-experience earlier traumatic events under psychedelics. For example, this was just studied in ayahuasca sessions, and it seems to be fairly common for people who've had adverse events and traumatic events. This is, however, not traumatic per se. It can be a terrible experience, a very unpleasant experience. Sometimes it apparently also be a very healing experience. Your mileage can really vary a lot here. So maybe a minority of psychedelic experiences can be traumatic, but most are not. Traumatic have some pretty interesting similarities with traumatic experiences. So what do they have in common? Both types of experiences, first of all, involve these significant acute alterations to cognitive processes and subjective experience. They share altered attention and memory thought processes, typically heightened emotions, sometimes also blunted emotions, feelings of unreality or dreamlikeness, altered sense of time and space and self. These are very broad generalizations. Traumatic experiences can be fight or flight type, or they can be shut down, dissociative experiences, and psychedelic experiences come in all shapes and forms. But what's also shared by them is that what kind of experience you have seems to be important for what happens later. So we have quite a bit of research now about psychedelic experiences, that certain kinds of psychedelic experiences are more linked to well-being, mystical type experiences, insight experiences, and so on. For traumatic experiences, we also know that certain types of traumatic experiences have implications for later symptoms, especially dissociating during the experience, suppression of affect during the experience. And here's actually my first suggestion for future research. For quite obvious ethical and practical reasons, we can't really study people being traumatized under the acute traumatic experience. We can't get them into brain scanners or give them questionnaires during that. It's a terrible idea. But we could try and characterize the acute traumatic experience with similar methods that we use for psychedelic experiences. That might be very useful for clinical and scientific purposes. Second, when these experiences are evaluated later, both traumatic and psychedelic, people often rate them as very highly central, meaningful, or significant to their lives. This is important because the memories for personally salient events, they tend to function as reference points for how we attribute meaning to other experiences, how we generate expectations for the future, and so on. And for trauma, research has shown that when people evaluate the event as highly central to their life, as a reference point for evaluating their life, this is associated with post-traumatic symptoms, with suffering, with maladaptive beliefs, and so on, which is very understandable. The traumatic event is a horrifying but luckily rare experience. It's not a good reference point to evaluate the world or your life. And it can have a very strong effect on beliefs and interpretations and so on. And an important part of healing is then understanding that the trauma was just one event or several events among many in your life, and rare ones, unlikely to be repeated. Psychedelic experiences, research shows, are often also rated as highly meaningful or significant, even the most significant in people's lives. And this suggests that they too can become important reference points, anchors for narratives, points of comparison. And this should be taken seriously when we think about things like informed consent and potential for transformations and so on. I'm quite convinced that sometimes psychedelic experiences can also become too central to people's understandings of the world. Both traumatic and psychedelic experiences can also be transformative. For example, in this sense explored by Laurie and Paul, they're both epistemically transformative and personally transformative. So the first means that both are often considered indescribable, difficult to put into words, very difficult for others to understand unless they've gone through them. And the second part means that people are quite literally transformed sometimes. Changes happen in personality, in values, priorities, core values. And this can happen for the better or worse in many ways. And it should be pointed out that even after traumatic events, people can change for the better, as in post-traumatic growth, which is, in addition to post-traumatic symptoms, often reported. And a recent study also using similar measures found elements of post-traumatic growth after ayahuasca ceremonies as well. Another similarity is that both traumatic and psychedelic experiences can lead to rapid, substantial changes in beliefs and worldviews. When it comes to traumatic experiences and their aftermath, these problematic beliefs and appraisals are actually really like at the key to the development and maintenance of PTSD and other symptoms. And having an effect on these beliefs is actually core to healing and treating PTSD, for instance, as my research and that by others has shown. Examples that from our research from adolescents exposed to repeated violent trauma, they highly endorse beliefs like, I have permanently changed for the worse, I must be vigilant at all times, life is not fair, I cannot trust people. On the other hand, post-traumatic growth is often also about new beliefs, appraisals, and understandings. Here's examples from our study among Syrian and Iraqi war refugees. They highly endorsed items such as, I discovered I'm stronger than I thought I was, knowing I can handle difficulties, I have stronger religious faith. For psychedelic experiences, even a very central theory about their mechanisms of action suggests that it's about to be revised. The sort of belief changes that have been studied after psychedelic experiences are more metaphysical worldview type beliefs, increased dualistic beliefs, increased religious belief, as was told us today, more endorsement of idealism, shifts toward panpsychism, and so on. It's perhaps a little bit surprising that we haven't studied these more mundane belief changes, like about the self and other people, as much in psychedelic experiences, not in quantitative studies anyway. Similar topics like insights and openness and so on have been studied. In one exception to this, there was a study where psilocybin use was found to decrease confidence in self-selected negative self-beliefs. But I think there would be value in applying these more sort of mundane measures of cognitive change to psychedelics as well. If we put this another way, we can also say that both traumatic and psychedelic experiences are occasions of potentially intense learning and adaptation, for better or worse. Although it may seem that the responses to traumatic experiences are often problematic and maladaptive, they're also attempts at adaptation. We experience something so horrific, so threatening, that we absolutely want to avoid it in the future. So that's why we increase our estimates for likelihood of harm, that's why we avoid, that's why we become hypervigilant, suspicious, and so on. It's just that these behaviors and changes are often problematic and cause suffering. And the sort of transformation that happens with psychedelics, the belief changes that happen under psychedelics, they're obviously not automatically healing either. For example, psychedelics enhance both fear acquisition, but also fear extinction. They increase suggestibility. The direction of these changes is highly context dependent. And if you think about this in terms of plasticity, well demonstrated for psychedelics, but also caused by acute stress. Plasticity, as famously said, is a very double-edged sword. So these are some of the similarities. I would like to point out two background factors that perhaps explain these similarities. What really connects these two types of experiences? First, they both present us with this highly novel, unexpected, surprising content that's often counter or incongruent to our beliefs, models, and schemas. This is one reason, I think, that these experiences are felt to be so salient, so meaningful, also why they have such power to change our views and beliefs and worldviews and even lives. In the trauma field, we often speak about assimilation or accommodation when people try to come to terms with this sort of unexpected information. When we assimilate, we try to hold on to our beliefs and models, and we try to fit the experience into those models and beliefs, by force or misrepresentation if necessary. This can sometimes be problematic. If we believe that bad things only happen to bad people, something terrible happens to us, and we try to fit that into our models, that means we must be bad people. On the other hand, if we accommodate the experience, this means that we revise our models and beliefs to account for this unexpected information. This can be successful, unproblematic, but also we can over-accommodate, change our beliefs and models too much based on this single example. I think this also fits psychedelic experiences quite well. We can try to fit this really weird experience into what we believed before. We can change our beliefs a little bit, or we can change them too much. Either way, it seems that for both of these experiences, the way we manage to integrate them into our lives and stories and worldviews requires making sense of them and understanding that they happened in their particular context. For traumatic experiences, they were just events in one particular time, in one particular place in space. For psychedelic experiences, they were just individual occasions in one altered state of consciousness. And what's been pointed out by others here already, I'd also like to it applies to both these experiences. The way that we're able to narrate, present, and integrate them really depends on the words we have at our disposal, also the forms of stories and scripts that we have. We often lack sort of sociocultural frames, expectations, and scripts that would allow us the entry of these type of novel, complex experiences into our life stories. This has been studied quite a bit with trauma, but I think not enough with psychedelics. A second fundamental reason explaining these similarities is that these are both states of high stress. Traumatic experiences are stressful by definition, but psychedelics, they also increase blood pressure, heart rate, they stimulate the HPA axis, they raise corticosterone, cortisol levels. We can wonder whether this is more of a cause or a consequence of the strange subjective experience, a little bit of both probably, but they are also sort of fundamentally stress-inducing. Stress is not all bad. It causes adaptation and all kinds of good things too. And here we've already heard a little bit about this sort of interesting and psychedelic experiences. The hypothesis of serotonin is a sort of stress detection and response system. So psychedelics have a lot of their effects famously through the serotonin 2A receptor, but acute stress is also associated with both expression and function of this very same receptor, especially in the cerebral cortex. And these receptors are linked to associative learning. So speculatively, and some recent findings have really challenged this idea, I have to admit, speculatively we could think that psychedelic experiences are activating or hijacking this sort of system for rapidly adjusting to changing circumstances or new threats. But even if this is wrong, we can still wonder about the other effects that stress has and what is their role in the psychedelic experience. Stress has great effects on learning, memory, attention. For example, it facilitates memory of things that we encounter during this stressful experience. It increases attention to novel things in our environment, and it also imparts meaning and significance to events. So in this fairly recent perspective, David and colleagues explored this idea a little bit, and they argued that stress really directly contributes to things like the salience of the psychedelic experience, the fact that we have vivid memories of it and judge it to be meaningful. So in addition to the weird content, the stress may explain why psychedelic experiences are ranked so high in meaning and significance. The stressfulness encodes the experiences as notable points of reference for later. Now, if this stressful experience imparts and enhances meaning and significance to whatever new thoughts and ideas, memories we have, this is important for therapeutic use. We'd want to be pretty careful about what we encourage people to think under psychedelics in that case. And this also links to the question of insights. So whatever novel ideas and points of view we might have, we might feel that they're more important, they're more true, they're more relevant, simply because we're under these effects, these stressful effects. So there's a potential for false insight and problematic beliefs. And I definitely argue with David and colleagues in this article that we should really look at the role of stress in the therapeutic effects of psychedelics. So, traumatic and psychedelic experiences, what are we talking about? Could we come up with an umbrella term or framework we could bring them under? The pivotal mental states idea was already mentioned at this conference as well. This is a framework that Brower and Carhart-Harris came up with a couple of years ago. Nice article there. And they defined pivotal mental states as a category of transient, intense, hyperplastic mind and brain states with exceptional potential for mediating psychological transformation. And they offered these criteria: elevated cortical plasticity, enhanced rate of associative learning, and unique capacity to mediate psychological transformation. They suggest also that acute stress is a crucial trigger for this kind of states, whether understood as psychedelic, spiritual, psychotic, traumatic, or whatever. Now, this is a fairly wide-ranging and speculative article, I'll admit, but I find this concept useful, and traumatic experiences definitely fit these types of criteria. What's important here is that the model doesn't favor positive outcomes over negative, and they emphasize the context and frames play a vital role in shaping the quality of the experience as such and its outcomes. If we think about traumatic and psychedelic experiences as these pivotal mental states, the traumatic experience it has an inherently strong negative context. So this might explain, obviously, why generally it leads to negative outcomes, even if the state has a lot of similarities with more positive experiences. Psychedelic experiences have much more varied, often more positive contexts. Maybe that's why their nature and outcome is much more varied also. But what's also special about these particular experiences is that they sort of appear to be caused automatically in most people. So they have these specific triggers. The shock of the traumatic event, the threat, and the psychedelic drug seem to be like reliable, immediate causes of these kinds of pivotal mental states. A psychotic break, for example, usually there are predisposing factors and chronic stress and so on, which slowly leads to it and so on. But these triggers seem to cause these states in almost anyone. Brower and Carhart-Harris claim that the pivotal mental state's evolutionary and adaptive function is to aid radical psychological change when its need is perceived. So the traumatic experience presents this acute need, obviously. People are radically changed. It's just that these radical changes are usually maladaptive and problematic. And psychedelics, on the other hand, can be used purposefully to trigger this kind of radical change, hopefully in an environment and context that then would direct this in a positive and healthy direction. So some conclusions and potential lessons and ideas here. Traumatic and psychedelic experiences do have a surprising amount of similarities. They're both potentially transformative events, times of rapid learning and change, and often really evaluated later as central and meaningful to people's lives. Content, a central reason for this could be that psychedelic experiences also are states of stress. This has implications for attentional memory processes, assignment of salience and meaning, and therapeutic uses as well. And I think appreciating these experiences, which we could maybe use the term pivotal mental states for, could highlight the possibility and importance of transformative experiences and the unique characteristics of this type of altered intense states that involve rapid adaptation and learning. Finally, and more practically, I strongly believe, as some others have also alluded to here, that future research on psychedelics could really benefit from taking more into account findings and tools that we already have in psychotraumatology and clinical psychology. For instance, measures of cognitive change, post-traumatic symptoms and growth, centrality of events, and so on. And I also think that best practices in managing traumatic experiences should be applied to strongly negative psychedelic experiences. It's just one example. The current clinical wisdom is not to interfere much, not to offer treatment in the immediate aftermath of traumatic experiences. There's findings that, especially if we sort of discuss the details of the trauma in a detailed way immediately after, this is more harmful than a good idea. So this really makes me think that if we have psychedelic experiences that are total train wrecks that involve horrific visions and anxiety, I would stay away from trying to integrate them immediately by describing them in detail to other people or something like that. What the trauma field could definitely learn from psychedelic research is more focus on the acute altered state of consciousness, trying to understand this peri-traumatic state. Could be valuable for understanding it and its effects on the resulting memory and the long-term consequences. On a final side note, what I'm trying to do and hoping to do in my current research is look at effects of these experiences on memory. We know that the memory of the traumatic event plays a very important role in its consequences, and trauma-focused treatment really works with the memory and so on. But we know surprisingly little about the effects of psychedelics on memories of our lives. Like, how do they affect recall and access to autobiographical memory? How do memories change if we recall them under psychedelics? And what really are memories of psychedelic experiences like? So that's what I'm hoping to change with my ongoing research. I was already hoping to launch a study here, but surely none of you are, but if any of you would be planning to take a psychedelic or MDMA in the future, you can follow me on social media to take a part in a citizen science study that will be starting in a few weeks about autobiographical memories under psychedelics. Questions and comments, more than welcome. Thank you.
Thank you for a very rich and interesting presentation. Now we have plenty of time for discussion.
Sami, thank you for such a rich presentation. I was wondering if you could share some thoughts with regards to dissociation, given that dissociation during a traumatic experience tend to increase the likelihood for PTSD, and if there's anything from your research that you could comment around dissociation during psychedelic experiences.
Yeah, a good question. And a topic that really has not been studied enough. Yeah, this is one example, I think, where measures from the general clinical psychology and psychotraumatology should be taken in. When we look at psychedelic experiences, there's a lot of specific questionnaires about what was the experience like, but maybe there's one study, but very few people have, for example, used a questionnaire for dissociative experiences, which would seem kind of obvious that people might have dissociative type experiences under psychedelics. But that really, these sort of existing measures have not been used that much. That whether people have those kind of experiences, they do seem to have them, but maybe they understand and conceptualize them differently because they understand that they're being caused by the psychedelic. I think the big difference is that they have this easy explanation for it. The drug is making me feel depersonalized and derealized and so on. So it's probably not as distressing an experience usually. And a lot of people also like to take dissociative drugs. They actually want to feel dissociated. So clearly that sort of state can also be highly negative or even be experienced as positive in some contexts. But it definitely should be studied. Yeah.
Thank you. So there was mentioned acute stress as a mediator of the therapeutic experience. I have noticed that many people come to ayahuasca ceremonies with the belief that no pain, no gain. And sometimes they are worried. I didn't suffer, I didn't vomit. Does it mean that I didn't get my healing? So the question is it obligatory to suffer for the therapeutic effect, or can it also be all nice and still useful?
Good, very good question. And this actually also relates to the question of memory effects that I would like to study. If we would better understand what is it like to reflect on negative experiences of your life and what happens to those experiences in a well-being, and what is it like to reflect on positive memories of your life, would that actually be a better idea to encourage people to think about the best things in their life and their most positive experience and try and let them have as positive and lovely an experience as possible? Is that actually more healing than asking them to go back and revisit their trauma and terrible? We don't know that. what would be a better idea to guide people towards trying to struggle through their trauma, or to just reflect on what they're grateful for and the best experience of their lives. I think both can be healing, but which is more? What's a better idea? It's an empirical question that I think absolutely should be studied. Yeah.
Thank you, Samuli, very much for this important talk, connecting more dots between psychotherapy research, psychotraumatology, and psychedelic research. I have two questions, actually. The first one is, I found it very inspiring, the idea to take knowledge from traumatology and apply it to psychedelic therapy. So you mentioned debriefing, probably should be avoided after a potentially traumatizing psychedelic experience. How about positive psychedelic experience? Is there a theoretical stance that you would take related to that?
Yeah.
Should it be different or the same?
I think it should be. This is speculative again, nobody studied, but I think it should be different. If you have positive experiences and you want to integrate those, but the question is really, do you want to enhance the vividness and meaning and centrality of the experience and the memory of that experience? Usually, if it was a positive experience, you would probably want to enhance it and remember it well and vividly and maybe come back to it and so on. And we know that if you talk about it to others in detail and you imagine it and share it and so on, then that's what will happen. So it would make sense that if it was a positive experience, this sort of sharing in a circle and everybody telling each other and really reliving it the next day and so on would be a good idea, probably. And I don't want to be too negative about the negative experience as well. If it was a struggle that ended in some sort of positive experience, maybe that's, this sort of survival arc might also be a very good memory to have. But if it was a total train wreck and you saw visions of your family dying and you had to take a trip killer drug and so on, then probably it wouldn't be beneficial to try and sort of describe it in great horrific detail to the next day. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you. And the second question is, when you suggest to connect trauma research, psychedelic research, who do you expect to, or who do you experience, which side do you experience to be more reluctant to that, the psychedelic researchers or the trauma researchers?
Yeah, that's a good question. Trauma researchers are very open to discussing MDMA-assisted psychotherapy, for example. That just sounds like using a drug to, do the same kind of work that we might otherwise do as well. I don't think there's much resistance there. But I think what could be a difficult suggestion is that we should somehow study in detail or focus on so much on sort of acute traumatic experience and understand it as. And trauma research speaks of altered state of consciousness. They usually just mean dissociation, that some which is considered a bad thing always, and it does predict more symptoms and so on. So if we say trauma-related altered state of consciousness, people usually think these are people who have dissociative symptoms. That's what they would think about. So in that sense, it might be a difficult idea to try and see other aspects of that experience. And just the fact, obviously, the traumatic experience is a terrible thing, and it almost always leads to suffering and so on. So suggesting that there's more nuance there can also be taken, the wrong way. And we got to be careful about how we talk about it, that we don't. When we study post-traumatic growth as well, you have to be careful not to suggest that everybody will grow after trauma, and if you haven't grown and your resilience hasn't increased as a result of your experience, then something's wrong. That's not true. A lot of people are just really hurt and don't find anything good in it whatsoever. That's also very typical. Sure.
Thank you for your presentation. I just want to hear a little bit more on your take on the centrality of the event, especially I'm thinking of a psychedelic experience that is highly positive. I don't remember, maybe it was Ram Dass or someone who said, maybe some of you remember that I was entering the gates to heaven again and again and again, and I was thrown out from the heaven again and again and again. And as far as I remember, he then turned to spiritual practices more than psychedelic experiences at some point of his life. And I'm just thinking, that there might be this effect on well-being, let's say maybe a negative even effect on well-being after very intense, beautiful, wonderful psychedelic experiences, if it becomes like a state hunting style, or if it's followed by, I don't know, deep frustration, inability to find that level of meaning and significance in just, day-to-day normal life, maybe emptiness, things like this. Because of this, I liked it that you brought up this centrality to memory, that maybe, what's your take on this, that maybe there could be this kind of effects as well?
Yes, that is a very good point, and it is something that we definitely see anecdotally and also in qualitative research and so on, that having had a huge peak experience or ecstatic experience, emotional breakthrough and so on, it's not always a good thing in the long term if that's, that becomes your sort of best memory of the last 10 years or something, and you start to compare the rest of your life to that. Obviously, it probably doesn't seem like much, your everyday life after that. And there are cases where people can even be depressed or have a more negative emotions later on when this sort of the afterglow magic wears off and so on. And you also mentioned this coming back and trying to recapture that state. This is something that happens with MDMA, certainly, that people try and recapture that glowing experience, and it can apply to classic psychedelics as well. That the feeling that you have in that acute state, that becomes so central and feels so meaningful. Meaningfulness is another way of looking at it. Most of our experiences don't feel as meaningful as the sort of very, very meaningful experiences that people can have on psychedelics. Whether that's real meaningfulness, that's debatable, but it's, people feel the same. It feels the same anyway. So it's a definite risk. Yeah.
Thank you for presentation and rich discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.